Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains so unfortunate. And today, we are going to discuss the Erie Lackawanna merger. Yep, another story of a merger of two railways that didn't really go that well at all. Really just no, it isn't quite as bad as the Penn Central merger, but it still didn't go very well. Here's the story of the fall of Erie Lackawanna. Welcome back to the 1950s in America. Cars and planes are on the rise, and rail lines all over the country are struggling to meet the needs of modern America. People just aren't using railroads like they used to. Trucking is taking over a lot of freight, and people are driving their cars short distances and taking planes longer distances. How are you gonna fix this problem? If you're a rail executive in the 1950s, you're thinking, merge. Yes, everyone's doing it. It's the cool thing to do. And to be fair, in certain aspects, a merger can work out very well. It is possible to actually fix a company's problems by taking two companies and making them into one. Not only are you combining profits and infrastructure, but you're also eliminating a competitor. You're no longer competing with each other. It's just you're one thing now. So, in some aspects, it could, in theory, work out. But it doesn't always. Sometimes that doesn't fix all the issues. And in Erie Lackawanna's case, that's kind of what happened. Now, Erie Lackawanna Railway was formed out of the Erie Railroad and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railways. Both had been historic rivals, much like New York Central and the Penn had been. But because of their own respective struggles, they thought, well, maybe we should try to be friends. And quite literally, they would literally join and become one. Their lines intersected in some places, and the parts where they didn't would be complemented by their respective infrastructures. Prior to the merger, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western had actually never dealt with a bankruptcy, but had started to see a significant downturn despite inherently being managed pretty well. They lost nearly $1 million in 1955, which was horrifying to them. Erie, on the other hand, had a lot of bankruptcies prior to this. Just so many. They had four bankruptcies over their history. 3 in the 1800s and 1 right after the Great Depression. Maybe not all of them were necessarily their fault, but the point is, they had been managed quite a bit differently and worse in some ways. Erie at the time was working on some innovative ways to curb their losses. They were encouraging industrial development along their properties and launching new trailer-on-flat car service, which was a really good idea at the time, as railways still use that today. But Erie in particular had always struggled with their competition. They were the fourth way to Chicago, competing against New York Central, the Penn and Baltimore and Ohio. Their route was actually slower than the competitors, but the one thing they had going for them was that their double-tracked main line was actually the best engineered out of all of them. It was very smooth, with very few grades or rough riding. So, in some aspects, you could argue their line was superior to the others, even if it was technically slower. But Erie was also heavily in debt, because of course they were. And they were the ones that in 1954 launched informal talks with Delaware Lackawanna about the possibility of, hey, can we be friends? Is that cool? That a cool idea? Please? This sort of thing, of course, can't happen overnight. Even if the two companies can agree, they still have to talk to the ICC about it, because the ICC was effectively in charge, at least when it came to this type of thing. Like I said in the Penn Central video, the ICC hampered a lot of railways when it came to them competing with the road and the air. The laws surrounding it were completely outdated, and it made it so that it was nearly impossible for them to switch their rates or even merge at times. Because as far as the ICC was concerned, it was still the late 1800s. It wasn't. But these two railways got creative when it came to actually doing a merger, as they sort of unofficially merged even before approval, in small ways. For one thing, on October 13th, 1956, Erie started using Lackawanna's Hoboken terminal for their commuter services, while at the same time closing their Pavonia terminal in Jersey City. On top of that, they also shared trackage between Birmingham and Gibson, New York. Such a thing was actually unheard of at the time, but they didn't want to just merge with each other. They also wanted to include a different railway, Delaware and Hudson. D&H would have been a big deal for this merger, as they were in significantly better shape. For the fiscal year of 1955, their net income was more than $9 million, better than both Erie and Lackawanna's combined. And D&H was much smaller, though they would also provide new markets through northern New York, as well as Montreal, Quebec. But on April 13, 1959, they dropped out of negotiations, not interested in merging with the other two. But both Erie and Delaware Lackawanna really didn't have a lot of options. They still pushed forward when it came to merging with each other, even without D&H. Today I'm bringing you a message from this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is something I'm actually genuinely excited to share with you because I've actually used them before for hands-on learning. When it comes to teaching myself stuff, I like to do things. I don't like to just be shown it. I don't retain anything that way. And Brilliant offers a whole bunch of different ways to learn just so many subjects, whether it be math, science, computer science, which helps with understanding algorithms, like on YouTube or Facebook, or things that might help you understand how the World Wide Web work. Well, Brilliant's got a lesson for that. Plenty of lessons, actually, all over the place. Even writing code, in case you wanted to learn to program something for yourself. A lot of this learning is stuff that you would be taught in a really expensive college course. But with Brilliant, you don't need to spend nearly that much money at all, and you can learn it on your own time. I, myself, have used Brilliant just to stretch my brain on occasion, using their app on my phone. Going through math and science all over again, just like I did back in school, well, it helps keep the brain sharp. And for my content, I kinda need to know what's going on when it comes to the old noodle up there. You know what I mean? And it really does help me quite a bit. Like I said, I'm a doer. So by continuously refreshing my brain, and even learning new things, I feel myself retaining my education. And that's something I value a lot. And you can get started with it too, with a special deal in the description of this video. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription service. This will give you access to just so much learning. So feel free to check it out. I highly recommend it. They used a consulting firm, Wire, Dick & Company, to prepare studies regarding how the merger could do cost savings and potential earnings they may have. Erie provided the western connection to Chicago, and the two roads could merge duplicate facilities as well as shed redundant trackage. The firm felt that the merged company could, in theory, generate $16.6 million in annual savings, but that was very dependent upon carrying out infrastructure improvements and acquiring new rolling stock and locomotives. But they also felt the net income would rise from $2.8 million in the merger's first year to $24.1 million after only 5 years. The process moved forward until finally, on September 13th, 1960, the ICC formally approved the merger. Erie Lackawanna was born, with a brand new logo, using the colors from Delaware Lackawanna, but using the diamond logo from Erie. Things looked bright at first. They officially began operations on October 17th, 1960, with an entire network of 3,031 miles. But despite the positive outlook, things didn't go well and rapidly went downhill. The rivalry between the two roads was something that was hard to overcome. Many of the top brass of both companies now had to work together, and they didn't always work the same way. This is a problem because if you paid attention during the Penn Central video, that's the exact same thing that happened to them. In this case, the Erie suits were the ones who were trying to keep things the way they were, and Delaware Lackawanna's were trying to move the company forward. But most of Lackawanna's officers were ignored in favor of Erie's. DL&W had always been the better managed railroad, Erie, like I said, had 4 bankruptcies. DL&W didn't have any. They might have had one if they hadn't merged, but that was due to a lot of things beyond their control. Erie Lackawanna would have been much better off had they actually been listening to all sides of a discussion. Instead, they usually just went with Erie. And the first chairmanship was awarded to a former Erie man, Harry Von Miller. He also initially had the duties as president and chief operating officer. The second in command was Lackawanna's former chief, Harry Schumacher. But Miller retired just months after the merger, and instead of Schumacher being named his replacement, as was logical, they just gave it to another Erie guy, Milton McKeans. Schumacher was kind of in a lame duck position. He had no direct decision-making duties, and later was quoted as saying, "I was made chairman, but I certainly didn't run the railroad." In 1961, the company lost more than $26.4 million, and then $16.6 million the following year. Because of the ICC, the merger had been rushed a bit. Not quite as bad as Penn Central, but it was still pretty rushed. There were a lot of inner workings that hadn't quite been streamlined yet. The railroads just didn't function the same way. They were managed differently. From the top to the bottom, things were not meshing as well as they should have been. Problems that should have been worked out well before were now being fixed on the fly, and it was costing them so much money. And with Erie's suits making all the decisions, a lot of Lackawanna managers just left, finding work elsewhere. By 1962, the road's long-term debt was at $322 million. It was in rough shape. But then they had someone new in charge. He was a man named William Bill White. He was actually a really respected guy. He started his career with Erie and worked his way up the corporate ladder. He wound up heading several companies, including Virginian, Lackawanna, and even New York Central at a point. He formally joined Erie Lackawanna on June 18, 1963, and his innovations started improving the road's significant downturn. He restructured the debt, for one thing, which really needed to be done. He also increased borrowing power to implement capital improvements to the rail line. A lot of these were loans, and while they did need to pay those back, the loans weren't being used to stay afloat. $59 million in loans were used for new locomotives and rolling stock to make things run more smoothly. He also did away with the road's failed less than carload or LCL policies to focus on more profitable long-haul movements. And he also tried, unsuccessfully, but he tried to eliminate money-losing commuter operations around New York and bring in more effective managers. White also felt that another merger was necessary, which, great, we're just gonna merge everything now, because he didn't think Erie Lackawanna could necessarily survive on its own. It needed a partner, someone that could work with them. Even if it wasn't a complete merger, maybe they needed new ownership. And they did wind up getting it. Norfolk and Western agreed to acquire them, but only at a distance. They didn't necessarily trust a complete merger given Erie Lackawanna's shaky position. So in order to shield their core assets, Norfolk and Western only acquired Erie Lackawanna by putting it under a holding company owned by them known as Derico Incorporated. The ICC approved this in December of 1966, and with Bill White still leading the company and under the protective umbrella of Norfolk and Western, things looked a lot brighter for Erie Lackawanna. Then Bill White died. Just suddenly, unexpectedly, tragically, the man passed away, and that was a significant blow to the company. It was largely his ideas that had been moving them forward, fixing a lot of their problems. He was replaced by a man named Jack Fishwick. He was from Norfolk and Western. Fishwick, to his credit, largely continued the trend that White had set, and his subordinate was Gregory Maxwell, who had been accomplished in the industry. By the late 60s, Erie Lackawanna posted its first ever profits due to a lot of aggressive cost-cutting, downsizing, and marketing. The marketing had really paid off, with the railroad gaining piggyback services and a contract with UPS in 1970. That gave them 5 new intermodal trains between New York and Chicago, and it was hugely profitable. That line to Chicago was Erie's major asset, and it's something Fishwick definitely recognized. They utilized it effectively, and things were looking well. Had things continued like this, Erie Lackawanna might have actually been successful. They may even still be around. So what went wrong? Hey guys, how's it going? The Penn Central merger was a disaster, but it wasn't just a disaster for people involved with Penn Central. It was a disaster for everyone around Penn Central. And in those days, that was the entire northeastern part of the United States. When Penn Central was formed on February 1st, 1968, this resulted in immediate issues for Erie Lackawanna. Because Penn Central had actually acquired New Haven, this really messed up EL's operations because New Haven had been an important interchange partner at Maybrook, New York, via Poughkeepsie Bridge. They had transferred tens of thousands of carloads annually in that area. But after the first year, numbers dropped by more than a third and had been cut in half through 1970. Penn Central could now carry this freight over its own rails. It didn't need the interchange. The other problem was that Penn Central was really screwing the pooch. People that were trusting them with their cargo often found them not getting it to where it needed to be. But they didn't just not trust Penn Central anymore. They didn't trust any railways at all. They started using trucks instead. So that also hurt Erie Lackawanna in a big way. In the early 70s, Erie Lackawanna started reporting declines of more than $17 million. And on May 8th, 1974, that interchange was closed entirely when the bridge burned down and Penn Central refused to fix it. And to be fair, they didn't have any money to fix it. So that's not really a surprise. By that point, they'd already declared bankruptcy. The announcement of Penn Central's bankruptcy threw the Northeast into an absolute tizzy. Every railroad around there thought that they were in deep trouble. And to be fair, they were. Penn Central encompassed a significant bulk of the area, and a lot of them interchanged with it. If they went under, a lot of their own lines would be kind of screwed. Other railways that had not already entered receivership were now also vying for court protections. Erie Lackawanna managed to avoid that until June of 1972, when Mother Nature decided she didn't like them. This is one thing that I really feel bad about because Erie Lackawanna did not deserve this, but this is exactly what they got anyway. Hurricane Agnes hit land and caused a massive amount of damage to the area. More than $11 million to Erie Lackawanna alone. This was something that they just couldn't deal with. They filed for reorganization on June 26, 1972. Not long after that, Norfolk and Western sold off all interests in the company, thus making them independent again. Though they were now in bankruptcy, so it wasn't like they were in a good situation. In 1970, Fishwick had actually returned to Norfolk and Western and handed over his duties to Maxwell. Maxwell ran the company as best he could in its final days. In 1973, Congress and President Richard Nixon actually passed a new act called the Shoup-Adams Act. It was also known as the Regional Rail Reorganization Act, or 3Rs. This act was a significant boon to railways at the time. It stipulated millions in government assistance to create what eventually became the Consolidated Rail Corporation, or Conrail. And their job was specifically to clean up the absolute disaster that was the rail lines in the Northeast. Erie Lackawanna was given the choice of joining Conrail or going alone. They still really wanted to do it their own way, and they made that decision official in 1974. That spring, the judge in the bankruptcy court gave the go-ahead for a reorganization, and at first it seemed like Erie Lackawanna was actually going to be Conrail's main competitor, but after another year of number crunching, the trustees involved with Erie Lackawanna kind of realized there was no way they were going to be able to do this on their own. It just wasn't possible. They didn't have the money. And in January of 1975, they asked for inclusion in Conrail anyway. But initially, that actually wasn't allowed to happen. The plan, like I said, was for them to be a competitor, and that would kind of give Conrail a monopoly on the area, and that's not really what the government wanted. Conrail was government-owned, but it kind of acted independently, so they still didn't want it to have too much power. There were a lot of alternate proposals given, such as giving Erie Lackawanna back to Norfolk and Western. The government proposed low-interest loans, and even a free $500 million to turn around the railroad struggles, but Norfolk and Western just wasn't interested. They'd already owned them. They knew what was going on. They were out. They were just out. It wasn't worth it. But Chessie was a bit more receptive to the idea. In October of 1975, Chessie formally agreed to acquire Erie Lackawanna, east of Sterling, Ohio, for $155 million. And then the last hurdle was to negotiate with Erie Lackawanna's labor unions. This did not go well. See, Erie Lackawanna had historically been really kind to their unions. Like, genuinely. The unions had had really lucrative contracts under their former company. But Chessie was not so kind. Chessie was a bit more, well, like a house cat, as their logo would suggest.
Humans, I'm not paying you anything for today.
What? You have to give us something. You can't even meet us in the middle? I mean, this is like half of what we used to get paid.
Too bad. Clean my litter box.
You want us to clean your litter box?
Yes.
For how much?
I'm not paying you. Clean my poop. Clean it!
Because of Chessie's inability to negotiate with the unions, well, the whole deal broke down, and Erie Lackawanna was just thrown in with Conrail. The problem then was they had showed up so late to the party that most of their lines only played a small role within Conrail. Conrail just didn't need 3 main lines to Chicago, and they wound up mothballing the entire Erie Lackawanna line west of Marion, Ohio, during September of 1977. The Erie Western Railway was formed soon afterwards to operate the ex-Erie Lackawanna from Wren, Ohio into Chicago. But the western extent of the old Erie had never generated much traffic anyway, and it relied largely on agricultural movements. That new short line soon realized that fact and entered bankruptcy during June of 1979. A new startup took over after that, which was named Chicago and Indiana Railway, but it failed so quickly that it ceased operations before the end of that same year. There are several heritage machines and pieces of rolling stock serving as reminders of Erie Lackawanna's failed attempt at success, and in some regards I actually feel a bit more sympathetic for them. They did make mistakes. They didn't get along well. The suits kept arguing. The merger happened too quickly, but they actually managed to turn that around. And then a whole bunch of things happened that had nothing to do with them. Something that they just couldn't control. They couldn't control how badly Penn Central would screw up. They certainly couldn't control getting hit by a hurricane. And they couldn't control that Chessie just wasn't willing to deal with their unions. And as a result, Erie Lackawanna is just kind of a memory now. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Tribal Typhoon Tommy Rossini, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Ty Hammonds Jr., Ohio Trucker 1, and Lord Captain Von Thrust III. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.